The gunshot that ended the war still echoed in Mason Yates's dreams every night, though the actual fighting had ceased 3 years ago in 1865. Clara Zimmerman heard his screams through the thin walls of the boarding house in Lead, South Dakota, where they both rented rooms on opposite ends of a narrow hallway that smelled of pine and old tobacco smoke. She had arrived in Lead 2 months earlier, fleeing a marriage arrangement her father had made with a Philadelphia banker twice her age, and the mountain town with its gold mines and rough edges seemed like the perfect place to disappear. Clara was 22 years old. With auburn hair, she kept pinned beneath a sensible bonnet and green eyes that held more determination than most men in town possessed. She had taken work at the general store, measuring out flour and sugar, cutting fabric for the miners' wives, and listening to the gossip that flowed as freely as whiskey in the saloons down the street. Mason's nightmares started around midnight, regular as clockwork. Clara would be lying in her narrow bed, reading by candlelight, when she would hear the first muffled cry. Then came the thrashing, the sound of bedsprings protesting, and finally the scream that tore through the darkness like something wild and wounded. The first few nights, she had pressed her pillow over her head, trying to block it out. But on the 5th night, she pulled on her robe and walked down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. His door was ajar. She pushed it open gently and saw him in the dim moonlight streaming through the window. Mason Yates was tangled in his sheets, his body rigid with terror, sweat gleaming on his bare chest and face. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and even in sleep, his jaw was clenched tight. He was maybe 25 or 26, she guessed, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. Clara did not think about propriety or what the landlady would say if she found them. She simply walked to his bedside, sat on the edge of the mattress, and took his hand in both of hers. His fingers were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who worked hard for everything he had. They were shaking violently. "You are safe," she whispered, her thumb moving in slow circles over his knuckles. "The war is over. You are home." The trembling continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Gradually, his breathing slowed. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased. His fingers stopped their violent shaking and curled around hers with surprising gentleness. He did not wake, but his face relaxed into something approaching peace. Clara sat with him until the trembling stopped completely, until his breathing became deep and even. Then she carefully extracted her hand from his, tucked his blanket around his shoulders, and returned to her own room. She did not sleep much that night, wondering if she had overstepped, wondering if he would remember in the morning when dawn broke over the Black Hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Clara dressed quickly and headed downstairs for breakfast. The boarding house dining room was filled with the usual assortment of miners, drifters, and working men. Mason was already seated at the long table, eating eggs and biscuits with his head down. He looked up when she entered, and their eyes met for just a moment. There was a question in his gaze and maybe something like gratitude, but he did not speak to her. Clara took her seat at the opposite end of the table and accepted a plate from Mrs. Henderson, the landlady. The day passed in the familiar rhythm of work. Clara measured out 20 pounds of dried beans for a miner's wife, helped a young woman select fabric for a new dress, and listened to the latest news about the mining operations that kept Lead alive and growing. The town had sprung up around the Homestake mine, and gold fever still gripped many of the men who poured into the Black Hills seeking their fortune. That night, the screaming came again. Clara waited, counting to 100 to see if Mason would settle on his own. When the thrashing grew worse, she rose and made her way down the hallway once more. This time, His door was closed, but she knocked softly and entered anyway. Mason was in the grip of the nightmare, his body arched off the bed, his hands clutching at invisible enemies. Clara sat beside him and took his hand firmly in hers. The trembling was worse tonight, traveling up his arm and into his shoulders. She held on, squeezing gently, and began to speak in a low, steady voice. "I am here. You are not alone. The fighting is over. You are in Leeds, South Dakota. You are safe in your bed. No one is going to hurt you." She repeated the words like a prayer, over and over, until the shaking subsided. This time Mason's eyes opened, unfocused and dark with confusion. He looked at her without recognition for several seconds, then awareness returned. He sat up abruptly, pulling his hand away, and ran his fingers through his hair. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough with sleep and embarrassment. "You should not have to see this." "No one should have to face their demons alone," Clara replied simply. She stood, smoothing her robe. "Try to rest. Morning will come soon enough." She left before he could respond, but she felt his eyes on her back as she walked away. The pattern continued for the next week. Mason's nightmares came like clockwork, and Clara went to him without hesitation. They did not speak much during those midnight visits. She would take his hand, hold it until the trembling stopped, and whisper reassurances until the terror passed. Sometimes he remained asleep. Sometimes he woke and looked at her with a mixture of shame and desperate relief. But he never asked her to stop coming. During the daylight hours they began to acknowledge each other. A nod in the dining room, a brief greeting when they passed on the stairs. Mason worked at the livery stable, Clara learned, caring for the horses and mending tack. He had a way with animals, people said. Horses that were skittish and mean-tempered would calm under his hands. It was Mrs. Henderson who told Clara about the war. The landlady was a gossip, but she was not unkind, and she had taken a liking to Clara since she paid her rent on time and did not cause trouble. "That Mason Yates fought at Shiloh," Mrs. Henderson said one afternoon while Clara helped her prepare supper for the boarders. "Terrible battle, that was. Thousands dead in 2 days. He was just a boy, really, not even 20 years old when he enlisted. Saw things no person should ever have to see." Clara's hand stilled over the potatoes she was peeling. "Does he have family?" "Not anymore. Parents died of fever before the war. He had a brother who fought alongside him, but the brother did not make it home." Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. "Mason came to Lead about a year ago, trying to outrun his memories, I suppose, but memories have a way of following a person." That night, when Clara went to Mason's room, she understood his nightmares with new clarity. She sat beside him and took his shaking hand, and when he woke gasping, she did not immediately leave. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "Your brother." Mason stared at her, his chest still heaving. For a long moment she thought he would refuse, would tell her to leave and mind her own business. But then something in his expression cracked open. "Thomas," he said. "His name was Thomas. He was 2 years younger than me, always laughing, always getting into trouble. He wanted to be a school teacher before the war. He loved books and learning, was always reading everything he could get his hands on." Clara waited, her hand still holding his. "We were at Shiloh together. The first day of battle, we got separated in the confusion. I spent the whole night searching for him among the wounded and dying, found him the next morning." Mason's voice broke. "He had been shot in the chest, died calling for our mother." "I am so sorry," Clara whispered. "I dream about it every night. About finding him, about not being able to save him. Sometimes in the dreams I get there in time, but I cannot stop the bleeding. Sometimes I am the one holding the gun. The dreams change, but they always end the same way." Clara squeezed his hand. "The mind tries to make sense of things that do not make sense. It tries to find a way to change what cannot be changed, But your brother's death was not your fault. Knowing that and believing it are two different things." "Yes," Clara agreed. "They are." They sat together in the darkness until Mason's breathing steadied. Before Clara left, he caught her hand one more time. "Why do you do this? Come to me in the night, I mean. You do not know me." Clara considered the question. "Because no one should suffer alone, because I can help, so I do." "Does there need to be another reason?" "Most people would not bother. Then most people are missing the point of being alive." Something shifted between them after that conversation. During the day, they began to seek each other out. Mason would stop by the general store on his way home from the livery stable, ostensibly to buy tobacco or a new handkerchief, but really just to talk to Clara for a few minutes. She learned that he had taught himself to read using his brother's books, that he loved horses more than most people, and that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise and made her laugh. Clara found herself watching for him, listening for his footsteps on the boardwalk outside the store. When he smiled at her, which was rare but becoming more frequent, she felt something warm unfurl in her chest. 2 months after Clara had first gone to Mason's room, the nightmares began to change. They came less frequently, and when they did come, the trembling was not as violent. But Clara continued her midnight visits, and Mason never suggested she stop. One evening in late September, when the air had turned crisp and the aspens on the hillsides were blazing gold, Mason waited for Clara outside the general store. He was dressed in his good shirt, his hair neatly combed, his hat in his hands. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Before supper, I mean, if you are not too tired." Clara smiled. "I would like that." They walked through the dusty streets of Lade, past the saloons where piano music spilled out into the evening air, past the assay office and the bank, and up into the hills where the trees grew thick and the noise of the town faded away. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. "I need to tell you something," Mason said when they reached a clearing that overlooked the town. "I need to thank you properly for what you have done for me these past months. You have given me back my sleep, or at least some of it. You have made me feel less alone. I do not know how to repay that kindness." "You do not need to repay it," Clara said. "I did not do it expecting anything in return. I know. That is what makes it so remarkable." He turned to face her fully, and in the dying light his eyes were the color of dark honey. "But I want you to know that it has meant everything to me. You have meant everything to me." Clara's heart was beating fast. "You have come to mean a great deal to me as well." "Have I?" There was hope in his voice, fragile and tentative. "Because I find myself thinking about you constantly. During the day while I am working, in the evening before sleep comes, even in my dreams now. You have replaced the nightmares with something better." "Mason," she whispered. He reached out and touched her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I am not a wealthy man. I have nothing to offer you except hard work and a damaged heart that is slowly healing. But if you would consider it, if you would give me the chance, I would like to court you properly. I would like to see if this thing between us could grow into something lasting." Clara turned her face into his palm. "I ran away from Philadelphia to escape a marriage my father arranged. I came to Lead because I wanted to choose my own path, make my own decisions. I never expected to find someone who would make me want to stay." "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes." Mason smiled, truly smiled, and it transformed his entire face. He looked younger, lighter, like the weight he had been carrying had lessened just a fraction. Then he leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful, as though she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. Clara kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her palms. The kiss was sweet and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, the stars had begun to appear overhead. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and that night when the nightmare came, Clara went to Mason's room as always. But this time, after the trembling stopped and his breathing calmed, he pulled her down beside him and wrapped his arms around her. "Stay," he murmured against her hair. "Just for a little while." Clara knew it was improper, knew Mrs. Henderson would have a fit if she discovered them. But she settled against Mason's chest and listened to his heartbeat, and for the first time since arriving in Lead, she felt like she had found home. The courtship that followed was conducted under the watchful eyes of the entire boarding house, and most of Lead besides. Small towns thrived on gossip, and the romance between the haunted cowboy and the refined Eastern girl was too good a story to ignore. But Mason and Clara did not care. They took walks together in the evenings, had dinner at the boarding house with everyone watching, and on Sundays, they attended church services together in the small wooden chapel at the edge of town. Mason continued to have nightmares, though they grew less frequent as the weeks passed. Clara continued to go to him, holding his hand through the shaking, whispering reassurances until the terror passed. But now, in the mornings, they would have breakfast together and talk about their plans for the day. Now, Mason would kiss her goodbye before heading to the livery stable, and Clara would watch him go with a smile on her face. In November, the first snow fell, blanketing Lead in white and turning the Black Hills into a winter wonderland. The temperature dropped sharply, and the boarding house residents huddled close to the stove in the evenings, sharing stories and warmth. Mason and Clara would sit together on the worn sofa, her hand in his, and listen to the others talk. It was during one of those evenings that Mason pulled Clara aside after supper. "I have been saving my wages," he said quietly, his breath misting in the cold air of the hallway. "I have enough now to rent a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it has a good stove and the roof does not leak. I was thinking that maybe, if you were willing, we could make it a home." Clara's breath caught. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's, the only thing I have left of her. I know it is not much, and I know you probably expected something grander from life, but I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy. I will work hard, I will be faithful, and I will love you with everything I have. Will you marry me, Clara Zimmerman?" Tears filled Clara's eyes. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Mason slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her there in the hallway with Mrs. Henderson peeking around the corner and trying not to look too pleased with herself. They were married in December, just before Christmas, in the same small chapel where they had attended services together. Clara wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Mason wore his good suit that he had brushed and pressed until it looked almost new. The preacher who performed the ceremony was an older man who had come to Lead during the gold rush and decided to stay to minister to the souls of the miners and townspeople. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. Clara's hands shook when Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, and his voice cracked when he said his vows. But when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Mason kissed her in front of their small gathering of friends and neighbors, Clara felt a joy so complete it was almost painful. They moved into the little house that same day. It was not much, as Mason had said, but it was clean and sturdy, and it was theirs. Clara had saved money from her wages at the general store, and she had purchased fabric to make curtains and a quilt for their bed. Mason had built a small table and 2 chairs, his first attempt at carpentry, and though they were a bit wobbly, Clara declared them perfect. That first night as husband and wife, they lay together in their narrow bed, wrapped in the quilt Clara had made, and listened to the wind howl outside. Mason held her close, his arms secure around her, and for the first time since the war ended, he slept through the entire night without waking. The nightmares did not disappear entirely. They still came occasionally, sudden and vicious, dragging Mason back to Shiloh and all its horrors. But now Clara was there beside him always, not just a visitor from down the hall but his wife, his partner, his anchor to the present. She would take his hand, hold him through the shaking, and whisper reminders of where he was and who loved him. Winter in Lead was harsh. The snow piled high against their door, and the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of their windows. Mason continued to work at the livery stable, though business slowed during the worst of the weather. Clara had quit her job at the general store after the wedding, but she took in sewing and mending to contribute to their household funds. They were not wealthy, but they had enough to keep food on the table and wood for the stove, and that was more than many could say. In the evenings, Mason would read aloud from the books that had belonged to his brother. Clara discovered that he had a beautiful voice when reading, rich and expressive, bringing the words to life. They would sit together by the stove, Clara sewing while Mason read, and those quiet hours became her favorite part of the day. "You ever regret it?" Mason asked one night in January. "Leaving Philadelphia, marrying me, ending up in this little house in a rough mining town?" Clara set down her needle and looked at him seriously. "Not for a single moment. In Philadelphia, I had a big house and fine dresses and every material comfort I could want. But I did not have freedom and I did not have love. Here I have both. I have you. That is worth more than all the fancy houses and silk dresses in the world." Mason closed his book and pulled her into his arms. "I do not deserve you." "We deserve each other," Clara corrected. "We found each other when we both needed someone most. That is not chance, Mason. That is something like fate." As winter turned to spring, the snow began to melt and Lead came alive again. The mines reopened fully, and prospectors flooded back into town seeking their fortunes. The streets turned to mud, then dried out as the days grew longer and warmer. Clara planted a small garden behind their house, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil with determination and care. Mason took on extra work at the livery stable, saving money toward a future he was beginning to believe in again. In April, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when the doctor in town confirmed it, she walked home in a daze of joy and terror. She was going to be a mother. She and Mason were going to have a child. That evening, she made Mason's favorite supper and waited nervously for him to come home. When he walked through the door, tired and smelling of horses and leather, she took his hands and led him to sit at their wobbly table. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart pounding. Mason looked at her with concern. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I am fine. Better than fine." "Mason, we are going to have a baby." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then tears filled his eyes and he dropped to his knees in front of her, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face against her stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby." Clara ran her fingers through his hair, her own tears falling freely. "Yes, in October the doctor thinks. Are you happy?" Mason looked up at her and his face was transformed with joy. "Happy does not even begin to cover it. Clara, you have given me back my life. You have given me hope and love, and now this. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," she said, pulling him up and kissing him. "We found each other." The pregnancy progressed without complications, though the summer heat made Clara uncomfortable and tired. Mason was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, and worrying constantly about her health. Clara found his concern endearing, even when it frustrated her. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one sweltering July afternoon when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I need to keep busy or I will go crazy in this heat." "I just want you and the baby to be safe," Mason said, his brow furrowed with worry. "We are safe. We are healthy. But you need to let me live my life, or you are going to drive both of us to distraction." Mason relented, though he never stopped worrying. His nightmares had become rare, only occurring once or twice a month now, but when they did come, Clara would hold him and remind him that he was home, that he was safe, that he was going to be a father. Those reminders seemed to help more than anything else, grounding him in the present and the future rather than the past. In September, as Clara's pregnancy entered its final month, Mason quit his job at the livery stable. The owner, a gruff older man named Samuel Peterson, had been impressed with Mason's work and his way with horses. He offered Mason a partnership in the business, a chance to own part of the stable and earn a better living. "I cannot believe it," Mason told Clara that evening, his face glowing with excitement and disbelief. "Sam wants to make me a partner. Me. A year ago I could not sleep through the night without screaming. Now I am going to own part of a business." "You have worked hard," Clara said, resting her hand on her swollen belly where the baby was kicking. "You deserve this, Mason. You deserve every good thing that comes to you." "We deserve it," he corrected, echoing her words from months earlier. "Everything I have, everything I am, is because you believed in me when I could not believe in myself." The baby arrived on a crisp October morning, just as the aspens were turning gold again and the anniversary of their courtship approached. Clara's labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Mason paced outside their bedroom while the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, who had come to help, attended to Clara. Every cry of pain that escaped the room made him flinch, and he prayed more desperately than he had since the war, begging God to keep his wife and child safe. Finally, just as the sun reached its peak, he heard a different sound. A baby's cry, strong and indignant. The door opened and Mrs. Henderson emerged with a smile. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife is tired but doing well." Mason did not remember crossing the room, but suddenly he was at Clara's bedside, looking down at his wife and the tiny bundle in her arms. Clara was pale and exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, but she was smiling. "Meet your son," she whispered, turning the baby so Mason could see his face. The infant had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. His eyes were closed, but his mouth was open in another indignant wail. Mason reached out with a trembling finger and touched the baby's cheek, marveling at how soft his skin was. "He is beautiful," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are both beautiful. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas after Mason's brother. It felt right, a way of honoring the past while looking toward the future. Little Thomas Yates was a healthy baby with powerful lungs and a strong will. He kept them up at night with his crying, demanded to be fed constantly, and filled their small house with noise and life. Mason took to fatherhood with an intensity that surprised even Clara. He would walk the floor with Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old songs his mother had taught him. He changed diapers without complaint, helped with the night feedings, and stared at his son with an expression of wonder that never quite faded. "I never thought I would have this," he told Clara one night as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping in a cradle Mason had built beside them. "A family. A home. Peace. I thought the war had taken all of that away from me forever." "The war took your brother," Clara said softly. "It took your innocence and your peace of mind, but it did not take your capacity to love or to be loved. That was always there, Mason. You just needed someone to help you find it again. You did more than help me find it. You gave it back to me." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. "Every morning I wake up next to you. Every time I hold our son. Every time I realize I am living this life and not just surviving it, I thank whatever force in the universe led you down that hallway to my room that first night." Clara squeezed his hand. "I thank it too." The nightmares had not come since Thomas was born. Mason's sleep was interrupted now by the normal sounds of an infant, not by the echoes of cannon fire and the screams of dying men. When Thomas cried in the night, Mason would rise and soothe him, walking the floor and whispering promises of safety and love. In caring for his son, he seemed to be healing some final broken part of himself. Winter came again, Thomas's first winter, and the little house was filled with warmth despite the cold outside. Clara had become skilled at stretching their money to cover their needs, and Mason's partnership in the livery stable was proving successful. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. On Christmas Eve, Mason surprised Clara with a gift. It was a shawl, beautiful and soft, made of wool dyed a deep green that matched her eyes. He had ordered it from a catalog months earlier, saving from his earnings to afford it. "It is beautiful," Clara said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "But you should not have spent so much." "You have given me everything," Mason replied. "I wanted to give you something special." Clara's gift to Mason was smaller but no less meaningful. She had written to the War Department, requesting information about his service. After months of correspondence, she had received documentation of Mason's honorable discharge and a letter from his commanding officer praising his bravery and dedication. She had framed them both. "So you can remember that you served with honor," she told him as he stared at the frames with tears in his eyes. "So you can remember that what you did mattered, even though it cost you so much." Mason hung the frames on the wall of their house, and sometimes Clara would catch him looking at them with an expression that was no longer just pain, but something more complex. Pride, maybe, or acceptance. Spring arrived again, bringing with it the end of Thomas's first year and the beginning of his transformation from infant to toddler. He learned to crawl, then to pull himself up on furniture, and finally, just after his first birthday, he took his first wobbling steps into his father's arms. Mason caught him and lifted him high, laughing with pure joy. Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and good. Mason's partnership in the livery stable continued to thrive, and he began to talk about expanding, maybe purchasing land where they could breed horses. Clara tended their home and garden, took in occasional sewing work, and watched their son grow with a mother's pride and love. They were building something together, a life that was wholly their own. In the summer of Thomas's second year, when he was a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. The news brought the same mixture of joy and nervousness as the first time, but now they knew what to expect, and Mason was more confident in his ability to support his growing family. "A second child," he said, resting his hand on Clara's still flat belly. "Our family is growing. Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Clara knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was too busy chasing after an energetic toddler to dwell on discomforts. Thomas, in his innocent 2-year-old way, did not understand why his mother's belly was growing, but he liked to pat it gently and babble to his unborn sibling. The nightmares that had once plagued Mason had become vanishingly rare. Months would pass without incident, and when they did occur, they were less intense, more like troubled dreams than full-blown terrors. Clara still woke when he grew restless, still reached for his hand in the darkness, but now sometimes he did not even wake, settling back into peaceful sleep at her touch. "You have healed," Clara told him one morning after he had slept through a minor nightmare without waking. "Maybe not completely, maybe never completely, but you have healed so much, Mason. You should be proud of yourself." "I healed because of you," he insisted, "because you held my hand and did not let go." "I held your hand," Clara agreed, "but you did the hard work of healing. You chose to keep living, to keep trying, to let yourself love and be loved. That was all you, Mason Yates." Their daughter was born in March of 1870, 5 years after the war ended and nearly 3 years after Clara first walked down that boarding house hallway to take Mason's shaking hand. The labor was shorter and easier than Thomas's had been, and when the midwife placed the tiny girl in Clara's arms, she felt a completeness that was almost overwhelming. "We have a daughter," she told Mason when he was allowed into the room. "A beautiful, perfect daughter." Mason looked at the baby, at her tiny features and the wisps of auburn hair that matched her mother's, and his eyes filled with tears. What should we name her? Clara had thought about this during the long months of pregnancy. "I think we should name her Grace. Because grace is what brought us together, and grace is what healed you, and grace is what has given us this beautiful life." "Grace," Mason repeated, testing the name. "Grace Yates. It is perfect. She is perfect." Grace was a calm baby, much easier than Thomas had been, though her older brother was suspicious of her at first. But Mason and Clara worked to include Thomas in caring for his sister, letting him help with small tasks, and gradually the boy's wariness turned to protective affection. He would bring her toys, try to share his food with her, and get upset if anyone made her cry. The years that followed were marked by the ordinary joys and struggles of raising a family. Thomas started school, learning to read with the same eagerness his uncle had once shown. Grace grew from a calm baby into a curious toddler who followed her brother everywhere. The livery stable prospered, and Mason's reputation as a horseman spread beyond Lead. People came from neighboring towns to have him train their difficult horses, or to purchase animals from the breeding program he had started. Clara's garden expanded, providing vegetables for their table and extras to sell or trade. She became known in Lead as someone with skill at sewing and mending, and a steady stream of customers brought her work. But more than that, she became known as someone with a kind heart and a listening ear. Women would come to her with their troubles, knowing she would not judge or gossip. The boarding house where they had met remained standing, and Mrs. Henderson grew older but no less interested in everyone's business. She would sometimes stop by their house to see the children and remind Clara and Mason that she had known they would end up together from the very beginning. "I could see it," she would say, settling into their kitchen with a cup of tea. "The way he looked at you, even before you started courting, and the way you cared for him, going to his room every night. I knew then that something special was happening." Mason's nightmares had become so rare by the time Grace was 2 that whole years would pass without incident. The war was receding into the past, no longer the dominant force in his life, but simply one chapter in a longer story. He could talk about Thomas, his brother, without falling apart. He could even talk about Shiloh, when circumstances required it, though he never sought out those conversations. One evening in the summer of 1872, when Thomas was 6 and Grace was 2, a veteran came through Lead looking for work. He stopped at the livery stable, and Mason recognized the hollow look in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he startled at sudden noises. This man was still fighting his war every day. Mason hired him on the spot and took him home to meet Clara. "This is James Cooper," he told his wife. "He fought in Virginia and is having a hard time finding his feet. I thought maybe we could help him the way people helped me." Clara did not hesitate. "We have a small shed out back that we could convert to a room. It is not much, but it would be private and warm." James Cooper stayed with them for 6 months, working at the livery stable and slowly finding his way back to himself. He had nightmares too, terrible ones that Clara and Mason could hear from their house. But Mason would go to him, would sit with him the way Clara had once sat with Mason, and gradually James began to heal. "You saved my life," James told them when he finally left Lead to return to his family in Kansas. "I was thinking about ending it before I came here. But you showed me there was still good in the world, still people who care. Thank you." After James left, Clara and Mason made it an unspoken mission to help other veterans when they came through town. They could not help everyone, and some men were too far gone in their pain to accept help. But they did what they could, offering work and shelter, and the understanding that only those who had survived trauma could provide. The children grew. Thomas became a serious boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Grace was more outgoing, making friends easily and filling their house with laughter. In 1874, Clara gave birth to another son, whom they named Samuel after the man who had given Mason his start at the livery stable. Samuel Peterson had passed away the previous year, leaving Mason his full share of the business, and naming their son after him felt like the right way to honor his memory. The livery stable was now fully Mason's, and he had expanded it considerably. He employed 4 men full-time and had contracts with the mining companies to provide horses and transportation. The breeding program had produced several excellent animals that sold for good prices. The Yates family was no longer struggling to make ends meet. They were prosperous, respected members of the community, but prosperity had not changed who they were at their core. Clara still took in sewing from women who could not afford to pay much. Mason still helped veterans who came through town. They taught their children the importance of kindness and service, of seeing the humanity in everyone regardless of their circumstances. In 1876, Thomas was 10 years old and reading at a level that would have made his uncle proud. Grace was 6 and starting school herself, bright and curious about everything. Samuel was 2 and getting into constant mischief. Clara, now 34, found herself pregnant for the 4th and last time. "I think this is it," she told Mason when she gave him the news. "I think this is our last baby." "Then we should enjoy every moment," Mason replied, his hand on her belly. Their final child was born in the winter of 1877, another daughter with Clara's auburn hair and Mason's dark eyes. They named her Hope, because hope was what had sustained them through the difficult years, and hope was what they wanted for all their children's futures. The years passed in a blur of school plays and birthday celebrations, scraped knees and childhood illnesses, laughter and occasional tears. Mason was 38 now, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his face lined with the marks of a life well lived. The nightmares had stopped entirely. He could not remember the last time he had woken in terror, could not remember the last time Clara had needed to take his shaking hand and whisper reassurances. "I am healed," he told her one night as they sat on the porch of their much larger house, watching the sunset paint the Black Hills gold and purple. The children were playing in the yard, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. "The war does not own me anymore. You freed me from it." "We freed each other," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder. "I was trapped in a life I did not choose, running away from expectations and duty. You were trapped in the past, unable to escape your memories. We found each other and we built something new together. Do you ever regret any of it? The hardship, the struggle, the years of me waking up screaming. Clara was quiet for a moment, considering. No, not for a single instant. Every difficult moment, every hardship, every night I held your hand through the terror, it was all worth it to get to this. To have this life, this family, this love. I would do it all again, Mason. I would walk down that hallway every single night for the rest of my life if it meant ending up here with you. Mason pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. I love you, Clara Yates. I have loved you since the first time I woke up and saw you sitting beside my bed, holding my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. I will love you until the day I die and whatever comes after. And I love you, Clara replied, always and forever. Thomas was 15 in 1879 and had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian. He had his father's way with animals and his uncle's love of learning, and Mason was saving money to send him to veterinary college back east. Grace was 11 and wanted to be a teacher. She had started helping the school teacher with the younger children, showing patience and skill beyond her years. Samuel was 7 and still trying to decide what he wanted to be when he grew up, changing his mind every few weeks. Hope was 2, a happy toddler who adored her older siblings and followed them everywhere. The livery stable had expanded to include a boarding stable for horses and a freight business that transported goods between Leeds and the surrounding towns. Mason employed a dozen men now and was considered one of the most successful businessmen in Leeds. But success had not made him arrogant or hard. He remembered too well what it felt like to have nothing, to be broken and lost. In the summer of 1880, 15 years after the war ended, and 13 years after Clara first took Mason's hand in the darkness, they decided to take their family on a trip. They had never been away from Leeds together, never taken a vacation or seen anything beyond the Black Hills. But now, with the business thriving and the children old enough to travel, they packed their belongings into a wagon and set out for Denver. The journey took 2 weeks, but it was 2 weeks of adventure and togetherness that none of them would forget. They camped under the stars, swam in cold mountain streams, and saw parts of the frontier that were already changing as civilization spread westward. The children were wide-eyed with wonder, and Clara and Mason found joy in showing them the world beyond their small town. In Denver, they stayed in a real hotel with running water and gas lights. They went to restaurants and shops, saw a theater performance, and walked through parks where people strolled in their finest clothes. It was a glimpse of a different life, one they might have had if circumstances had been different, but when it was time to return to Leeds, they were all ready to go home. The noise and crowds of the city were overwhelming after the quiet of their mountain town. They missed their house, their routines, the familiar faces of neighbors and friends. Home is not a place, Clara said as their wagon crested the final hill and Leeds came into view. It is the people you love and the life you build together, but I am glad our place and our people are here. The children grew older. Thomas went off to veterinary college in 1882, breaking Clara's heart a little even as she was proud of him. He came home for holidays and summers, bringing stories of his studies and his life in the city. But he always said he would return to Leeds permanently when he finished his education. The Black Hills were in his blood, and he could not imagine living anywhere else. Grace followed her brother east in 1886, attending a teacher's college in Illinois. She was 18, confident and capable, and Clara tried not to worry too much about her daughter in a city so far from home. Grace wrote letters every week, describing her classes and her new friends, and Clara read them aloud to the family at dinner. Samuel showed an aptitude for business, and began helping his father run the livery stable when he was just 14. He had a head for numbers and an easy way with customers that made him valuable. Mason began to teach him everything he knew, preparing him to take over the business someday. Hope, the youngest, was turning out to be the artist of the family. She loved to draw and paint, covering sheets of paper with images of the mountains and trees, horses, and people. Clara found her art supplies and encouraged her talent, remembering her own thwarted dreams of independence and wanting better for her daughter. In 1888, when Mason was 49 and Clara was 46, Thomas returned to Leeds with his veterinary degree and a bride. Her name was Margaret, and she was a kind woman who loved animals as much as Thomas did. They set up a veterinary practice in town, the first in Leeds, and Thomas divided his time between treating animals and helping at the livery stable. That same year, Grace returned from college with her teaching certificate and took a position at the Leeds school. She was unmarried and determined to remain that way for a while, wanting to establish her career before thinking about romance. Clara understood, remembering her own flight from an unwanted marriage, and she supported her daughter's choices. The 1890s brought change to Leeds and to the entire West. The frontier was closing, settlements were growing into towns and towns into cities. The railroad had reached the Black Hills, making travel easier and bringing more people and commerce. The days of the wild, lawless West were ending, replaced by something more civilized and structured. Mason and Clara watched these changes with mixed feelings. They had come of age in a rougher, more dangerous time, and there was a certain nostalgia for those days even as they appreciated the progress and safety that came with civilization. But mostly they were grateful to have lived through it all together, to have built a life and a family in this challenging place. In 1892, Samuel married a local girl named Catherine, and they moved into a small house near the livery stable. A year later, they gave Mason and Clara their first grandchild, a boy they named Mason Jr. The older Mason was overcome with emotion when he held his grandson for the first time, marveling at the continuation of their family line. "Your Uncle Thomas would have loved this," Clara told him, watching him cradle the baby. "He would have loved knowing that his name lives on through our son, and now through our grandson as well." "I think about him sometimes," Mason admitted. "I think about what his life might have been if the war had not happened. But then I realize that if the war had not happened, I would never have met you. Our children and grandchildren would not exist. It is a terrible trade, but I cannot wish it different because it brought us together." "We honor Thomas by living well," Clara said. "By raising our children to be good people, by treating others with kindness, by building something lasting. That is the best tribute we can give him." Grace married in 1894, choosing a fellow teacher named William who shared her passion for education. They had a small wedding in Leeds, and Clara cried happy tears as she watched her daughter pledge her life to someone who clearly loved and respected her. Grace and William settled in Leeds, continuing to teach at the school and talking about starting a family of their own. Hope, at 17, was still focused on her art. She had begun selling her paintings to tourists who came to see the Black Hills, and she dreamed of studying at a real art school someday. Mason and Clara encouraged her, wanting all their children to pursue their passions. In 1895, Thomas and Margaret had their first child, a daughter they named Clara. The older Clara wept when they told her, touched beyond words, that they would honor her in this way. Little Clara was a quiet baby with auburn hair like her grandmother, and holding her felt like closing a circle that had opened so many years ago. The turn of the century found Mason and Clara in their late 50s, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching the world change around them. The livery stable was now primarily run by Samuel, though Mason still went there most days, unable to fully retire from work he loved. Clara's days were filled with grandchildren, sewing and tending her garden, which had become legendary in Leeds for its productivity and beauty. They still slept in the same bed they had shared since their wedding night, though it was now in a much larger house that Mason had built as the family grew. And every night, whether out of habit or need, they would reach for each other's hands in the darkness before falling asleep. The nightmares had not come in over 20 years, but the gesture remained, a reminder of how they had begun and what they had overcome. "Do you remember that first night?" Clara asked him one evening as they prepared for bed. "When I came to your room and took your hand." "I remember every detail," Mason replied. "The way you looked in the moonlight, the gentleness of your voice, the warmth of your hand in mine. I remember thinking I must be dreaming, that no one would really do that for a stranger." "You were never a stranger to me," Clara said. "From the first moment I heard you cry out in your sleep, I felt connected to you. I knew I was meant to help you. You did more than help me. You saved me. You gave me back my life. And you gave me mine. We saved each other, Mason. That is what love does." In 1902, Mason and Clara celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary surrounded by their 4 children, their spouses, and 8 grandchildren. The house was full of noise and laughter, of children running and adults talking, of food and music and joy. Looking around at all they had built, Mason felt a contentment so deep it was almost like peace. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Mason and Clara sat on their porch under the stars. The Black Hills rose around them, eternal and unchanging, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and summer flowers. "I have been thinking," Mason said, his hand holding Clara's as it had held it for so many years, "about how different my life could have been if I had not survived the war. If I had given in to the nightmares and the pain, if I had never met you. It is staggering to think about how one moment, one choice, one person can change everything." "We all have those moments," Clara replied. "Mine was deciding to run away from Philadelphia instead of marrying the man my father chose. If I had stayed, if I had been obedient and dutiful, I would have lived a comfortable life but not a happy one. Coming to Leeds, finding you, it was the best decision I ever made." "Do you think Thomas knows?" Mason asked, looking up at the stars. "My brother, I mean. Do you think he knows about our life, about his namesake and all that has come from that terrible day when I lost him?" "I do," Clara said with conviction. "I think he knows, and I think he is proud of you. You did not let the war destroy you. You found a way to honor his memory by living a life full of love and purpose. That is what he would have wanted for you." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The wind rustled through the trees. It was a moment of perfect peace, earned through years of struggle and healing, of love and perseverance. As they finally rose to go inside, Mason pulled Clara close and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for that first night when you took my hand. For every night since, for building this life with me, for never giving up, even when I wanted to give up on myself." "I would do it all again," Clara replied, the same words she had spoken so many years ago. "Every single moment. Because it led us here, to this beautiful life we have created together." They walked into their house hand in hand, just as they had walked through every challenge and triumph of their marriage. The nightmares were long gone, replaced by dreams of their children and grandchildren, of the life they had built from the ashes of war and pain. Mason Yates, who had once woken screaming every night, now slept peacefully beside the woman who had saved him. And Clara Zimmerman Yates, who had fled an unwanted marriage to forge her own path, had found a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. The years continued to pass, bringing new grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The livery stable prospered under Samuel's management, becoming one of the most successful businesses in the Black Hills. Thomas's veterinary practice grew, and he trained other veterinarians to meet the growing need. Grace and William became beloved figures in Leeds' educational community, influencing generations of children. Hope pursued her art and eventually opened a small gallery in town, bringing culture and beauty to the mining community. But through it all, the foundation remained the same. Mason and Clara, their hands intertwined, their love unshakable, their commitment to each other absolute. They had started with nothing but trauma and hope, and they had built an empire of love and family that would endure long after they were gone. In 1910, Mason turned 71 and Clara 68. They were grandparents to 15 grandchildren and had recently welcomed their first great-grandchild. Their bodies were slower now, marked by age and hard work, but their spirits remained strong. They still took walks together in the evenings when weather permitted, still talked late into the night, still reached for each other's hands in the darkness. One warm September evening, as golden as the day they had first walked together so many years ago, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. The colors were spectacular, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed almost unreal. "It has been a good life," Mason said quietly. "The best life," Clara agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible when I was a scared girl running away from Philadelphia." "Do you have any regrets?" Clara thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Not a single one. Everything we went through, every hardship and struggle, it was all worth it. We built something beautiful together, Mason, something that will outlast us. I could not have done it without you. And I could not have done it without you. We were meant to find each other, I think. Two broken people who made each other whole." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared overhead, Mason raised Clara's hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Clara Yates, from that first night when you took my shaking hand until this moment and beyond. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. And I love you, Mason Yates, my cowboy who woke screaming from the war, who I held until the shaking stopped. Thank you for letting me into your life. Thank you for building this beautiful family with me. Thank you for every single day we have had together." They sat together as darkness fell, hands intertwined, surrounded by the mountains they had made their home and the life they had built together. It was not the life either of them had expected or planned for, but it was exactly the life they needed. And as the stars came out one by one above the Black Hills, Mason and Clara Yates knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them the same way they had faced everything else, together, with love, and with their hands held tight against the darkness.